Thanks, Chris. Dali runs at the National Gallery of Victoria until October the 2nd. One of the most enduring images of last year's Beijing Olympics was that amazing translucent blue building, the now famous watercube. What's less known is that it was partly the vision of German-born, now Sydney-based architect Chris Bosse. Now very much established on Australia's architectural scene, Fenella recently caught up with this most intriguing architect.
Chris Bosse, thanks for joining us. Nice to meet you.
My pleasure, and nice to meet you.
Now, in a relatively short amount of time as an architect, you've made quite a massive impact, especially with, of course, the watercube in Beijing for the Olympics. Just tell me a bit about that experience.
We won a competition in 2002 to design the Olympic National Swimming Centre against the top 10 architects in the world, and was thrilled to be part of that.
The concept of the bubbles, this was something that came from your brain, your head?
The idea of soap bubbles and sort of crystals as a structure is an idea that is probably hundreds of years old. My professor in Stuttgart, Professor Frei Otto, had an institute that did nothing else than looking at soap films, soap bubbles, soap structures as a typology for architecture and engineering. I think a good piece of architecture is like a good book or like a good piece of art. It has to work on many different layers. The watercube in Beijing is essentially a blue box, a blue square box. The square box comes out of the ancient Chinese idea of the Forbidden City being a rectangular building or rectangular array of buildings.
When it was finally constructed, what was that like?
Well, it's, in my personal life, was probably the most anticipated moment. 2008, the 8th of August, 8 o'clock, to see this building and how the public reacts to it. And it's certainly a life-changing experience. It was great to see that the people loved the building so much. It's a building for 17,000 spectators in the building. It's a building for athletes who perform at their best during the Olympics, but it's a building for the world community to appreciate as a contribution to Chinese architecture, to world architecture, and to new technologies.
A lot of your work is actually inspired by nature. I'm just curious about how that actually manifests itself.
The idea of nature in art and architecture, I think, is centuries old. Leonardo da Vinci was drawing inspiration from nature. Borromini's churches in Rome are based on nature. Frank Lloyd Wright started organic architecture in the 60s and before. And in 1970, Frei Otto in Germany designed a stadium, which is the Olympic Stadium 1972 in Munich, based on the theory of soap films. So the idea that a building is form-found rather than designed. He would experiment with surface tension within soap films, pulling up wires, dipping them into soap films, and the shapes in between would become the roof for the stadium.
So are you looking to mimic nature?
I guess there's a risk in mimicking natural shapes by purely replicating the look of something. To design a city that looks like a leaf is not a very smart idea, although it might look good. The idea is more looking at a leaf, how the leaf distributes the water to the points, every point on the surface of the leaf, and how it interacts with the sun and how it does photosynthesis, and learning from the system and implement that, for example, into a traffic stream that runs through a city and distributes cars and people and bicycles.
Another thing that you actually do, of course, is to trail your ideas for architecture through art and installation, and you currently have something happening at Customs House in Sydney. Tell me about that project.
Yeah, we use small-scale projects as fields for experimentation for large-scale projects. A building or a city takes 5 to 10 years from conception to realization, and a lot of things happen in between: political changes, economic changes. As you know, a lot of projects worldwide are now on hold. And small projects help us to develop these ideas and then scale them up for other applications.
How do you go about actually making your design environmentally friendly?
We want to design cities and buildings fundamentally green from the bottom up. Interestingly, the newer cities, which should be like the 21st century cities, emerging countries, emerging societies, booming societies, should be the most environmental and the most inhabitable cities in the world. But they turn out to be the worst cities with traffic, pollution, industry, the population explosion sort of faces these problems, which we want to respond with fundamental changes in planning from the start.
And is that in some ways why you're so excited about this potential project at Masdar City and Abu Dhabi?
Yeah, Masdar City is a project, a government initiative in Abu Dhabi. And Abu Dhabi, out of all countries, are now the front runners in sustainable technologies, in solar technologies, in wind technologies. And they're building an entire city based on sustainable principles. When you think of Sydney as a city that has introduced a free shuttle bus between Chinatown and the CBD as a green sort of initiative, the city Masdar has a public transport system throughout the entire city, which is a free network of magnetic driverless cars. So it's a car-free city and a carbon-neutral city. The entire city is driven by solar, photovoltaic cells and solar fields on the outside of the city. So the entire city exists, but it has zero footprint.
It's magic.
Yeah, that's amazing. And it's interesting that these often criticized sort of oil-rich countries in the Middle East under extremely difficult living conditions, very hot, very humid, and so on, that they are all of a sudden the ones that come forward with great ideas, great technologies, and get all the international brains together to develop the future of the world.
So you need the empty space in some ways to be able to create these sorts of things. I mean, for example, in Sydney, how far is these ideas of sustainability actually going? Are we doing a good job at all?
Well, it's not like Australia doesn't have space at all. And it's not like Australia doesn't have an ocean around, and it's not like it has sun all day long and it doesn't have wind. It's just that Australia doesn't harvest these technologies and implement them in a sustainable manner. The sort of single-family house carpet across the suburbs, all throughout Australia and America and largely Europe, of course, is the most unsustainable form of living. It's the Australian dream to have your own house. If it's semi-detached, it's not as good as fully detached, which means you have essentially 4 walls and a roof, which are exposed to the outside. When you think of a residential tower, where you have 400 apartments stacked on top and next to each other, it's an extremely dense and efficient building system, which is sustainable through density. It doesn't lose a lot of air and heat and energy.
But what you have there is a problem inherently in the idea when everybody wants space, they don't want to live in dense situations. How do you solve that battle between those two ideals?
In Australia, it's seen as uncool to live in an apartment. That's the worst insult. I said to someone, I like your apartment, but it was actually a semi-detached house. It's the worst insult, but it was just a 80 square meter or 120 square meter single-level space. It could have been in the center of this amazing residential block and would have had a swimming pool and a gym and a sauna and a cinema complex, but because it was a house, it's so valuable. And I think that's the fundamental mistake.
Now, Brian Eno, who was in Australia recently for the Luminous Festival, said that cities are no longer about architecture, but they are about atmosphere. What do you think about that idea?
I think it's a very smart comment. Atmosphere is, of course, only one aspect. A city has to function, it has to perform, and it has to create a great atmosphere. And a great atmosphere is sort of Walt Disney. That's a great atmosphere, but we need sort of what's behind that as well.
And what about the role of iconic buildings, such as, say, the Opera House? How important are they?
I think the Opera House has fundamentally changed the role of architecture in Sydney and the perception of Sydney throughout the world. At the same time, there's a risk in out-iconizing each other in cities like Dubai, where every building is an icon, and you have this forest of icons, and you can't see the icon anymore. I guess the fundamental fabric of a city like Paris, for example, is based on the fact that 90% of the city is not trying to be special, but then you have the Eiffel Tower, you have Centre Pompidou, and you have the Louvre, which are special, which are public, which are sort of for the community. And that creates a successful city.
Well, it's been fantastic to meet you. Thank you so much, Chris.
Thank you.
Interesting man.